Okay, thanks everyone for coming along today. It's a big crowd, that's good, that's exciting. Hands up, any designers in the room? Okay, you guys will probably all want to leave because we're going to be down and dirty today. Who was at my previous session today? Oh, okay, and you came back. Unlike one guy. Where is he? Let's just have a look at the evaluations, shall we? No enthusiasm. Does anyone like to own up? No? I guess you didn't have the enthusiasm to come back for another round. I don't blame you. What do we get here? Averaging 3.15 for satisfaction, 3.3. Let's see if we can push it over 3.5 today, guys. I know we can do it together. In fact, it's mainly up to you. Okay. Oops, let's get rid of that. So are you sick yet of all these foreigners coming in and trying to suck up to you with telling you how much they love pineapple lumps and how much they love wearing their jandals and their jerseys when they go to the dairy for their L&P, all that crap? We'll just take that as read, shall we, and get right into it? My name's Shane Morris. I'm a user experience architect, user experience designer, user interface designer, information architect, interaction designer. Basically, I've been doing this for a long time, designing applications and websites and all sorts of digital products, hardware, kiosks, all sorts of stuff. And I'm all about the user experience. I'm all about making software and technology products easier to use, more enjoyable, more engaging. And that's what I'm going to share with you guys today. We have got a lot to cover. So strap yourselves in. Thank you. Excellent enthusiasm. At this point, if you'd just like to fill out your evaluations now, because once I go off this coffee high, we go to a dark place. Speaking of a dark place, we're going to talk about design today. I love talking to design to developers because you guys have, those of you who are developers, have the best design sense because you all know that black is basically a basic tenet of design, so really appreciate everyone who's turned up in black today. I'm pretty happy myself with the outfit, and that's why I love coming to New Zealand. Oh, that's coming to the New Zealanders. So we're going to talk a little bit about developers and other sorts of engineers and their role in creating the user experience, because it's not all about designers and it's not all about design. Unlike previous talks I've done here, where I've talked about user experience strategy and all the processes and techniques, what I want to talk about today is really the pixels. Talking about the placement of stuff on the screens and pages, fonts, colors, logos, and widgets. But having said that, I am going to do a little bit of before you start stuff. I'm going to try and go through it really quickly, because at the end of the day, I don't want any of you guys to leave thinking that user experience is all about colors, fonts, and logos, because it's not. In fact, it's about most of your user experience work happens long before that. Then we'll talk about, we'll just sort of place these sorts of activities in the user experience design lifecycle. And then basically I want to give you 4 tips to lay out any page or screen. And I want to give you 6 tips on how to visually present content on a page or screen. And like I said, and I was serious, for the designers in the room, there won't be very much new. In fact, some of this will be a little bit patronizing. So why? Because at the end of the day, I'm passionate about UX. I love working in user experience and design. I have many colleagues who want to do that and enjoy doing that as well. But we're outnumbered, and we're outnumbered by all the other people who, at the end of the day, have a stake in and, in fact, form the final user experience. How many of us are working on a project today who have dedicated design/UX people in it? Right, so that's my point, okay? About, somewhere between 5 and 10%. At the end of the day, professional designers aren't working, on the vast majority of IT projects, and so it comes down to the other people on the project to be responsible for the user experience. And at the end of the day, whether you've got people on your team who do design or not, at the end of the day, it's what gets coded that is the final user experience. So Doesn't matter how much good work I do up front, it's what you guys, and I'm just going to treat you all as generically as coders today just to keep things simple. It's what you guys actually implement that is the user experience. And so that final user experience is determined by a whole bunch of factors outside of my control and some within my control. And the first thing is, what actually gets built is determined by what you guys have time to build. And it's something that we as designers are guilty of ignoring because it doesn't suit us to think about the impacts of what we're doing. So good designers will work with good developers to constantly have that dialogue about how what we're doing fits into the broad sense of what's possible. I don't mean to say that you should shut designers down immediately. They think of something that's a little bit outrageous, because sometimes the germ of an awesome idea starts as a crazy idea. So give your designers a little bit of room if you're working with designers, or give yourselves a little bit of room to explore beyond the bounds of what's immediately obviously doable. But at the end of the day, what you don't want is to inherit a design that can't be built, because what happens is after I leave, a whole bunch of compromises get made to the design in my absence, and I'd much rather that happen while I was there so that we could debate what were the right compromises rather than have those compromises made at code time. Then it comes down to what you guys know how to build, or what you guys know how to build in the time available. What you can be bothered building, which is not meant to be an insult. The best designers that I've worked with are the ones who know how to work well with the rest of their team. What you don't want to work with is one of those designers who shows up, gives you an intense period of work, hands you a deliverable roughly 1/3 of the way through your project, and then racks off, and then comes back to the launch party, and possibly the first thing they'll say when they see the final product is, "Am I at the right launch party?" A good designer works as part of the team and has to make sure that we understand, where and what can be built. And I'll be honest, right? When I walk into a new team, as I often are asked to do to help with the user experience, skill building within the team, I'm on the lookout for the people who are most sympathetic and the most enthusiastic about UI. I'm no apologies about that, because those are the people who I'm going to be able to gee on and excite, and maybe excite a little into doing something interesting or something a little bit more awesome. So it is all about motivation. And if I wouldn't be a real human-centered designer if I wasn't thinking about that in the relationships I have in my work. Then there's the thing that we always screw up, the user interface specification. That's if you're working on a project that has a user interface specification. We traditionally either make it way too complex to the point it's unusable in itself, and so you guys just shelve it, or we make it way too lightweight. We make these beautiful sort of coffee table edition user interface specs that the project sponsor loves and shows to all his mates, but are useless to you guys when it comes to build time. So at the end of the day, you guys have control over the user experience, and so I want to talk about what non-designers can do about user experience, which is why I've called this talk Pimp My App. Because it's all about saying, well, for all the work that has or hasn't been done in defining the user experience architecture, just defining the information architecture and the navigation model, at the very least what we can do is make sure that we're being diligent on the surface, on the individual screens and pages, and hopefully we can make some awesome together. What? That's my car. So let's do a quick survey. So think about the project that you're currently involved in, or the last project you were involved in. I've got 5 questions just by show of hands. First question is whether or not you had user experience requirements set up front. And I don't mean a user interface spec. I mean some sort of description of what the user experience we're trying to achieve is, what we're trying to get out of our user experience. How will we know when we're creating a good user experience? What is our definition of good? So if your current project, how many of you had this set up front? About 5%. Just draw a little cross about. Oh, come on. No. I want to draw on. I'll do it this way. About there. Within your project, how many of you can point to someone who is responsible for the user experience? Doesn't mean they have to draw every screen, but they have the responsibility for the user experience. That's better. Sorry? It could be the developer. Yeah, that's not the point. The point is, and this is one of the, when people say, what can I do to improve the UX of my product with relatively little investment, Shane? I say one of the first things you can do with your existing resources is just point out the one or two people who are going to be responsible for the user experience. And it doesn't matter whether they are or are not experienced designers, hopefully that they've expressed some sort of interest. Just by identifying someone who is the sort of conduit for those UX decisions is a great start for improving your user interface. How many of you have a UI spec delivered to you before you start coding the UI?
Does that count really bad ones?
Yeah, in any form. Okay, about the same, maybe slightly more. Yeah, even really bad ones is better, well, potentially better, depending on the individual, than trying to come up with the UI at code time. What tends to happen if you're responsible for inventing the UI at code time is you do what you need to do first, right? Which is get your functionality organised, because that's what you're really being measured on, right? How many function points you've delivered or whatever it is. So you kind of get your functionality right, and of course that needs some sort of test harness UI, and then within whatever remaining time you have, you think about how you can make the UI a little better. And so the first problem is you may not have a lot of time to make it better. The second problem is you're thinking about the UI in isolation. You're thinking about the UI for your bit. And possibly not thinking about the broader user experience of the total website or the total product. So just getting into a habit of getting specs designed before code time, for better or worse, will help to start the whole team thinking about the whole experience rather than individual chunks of user interface. Usability testing is when you take your product and you show it to real users and you step back, you don't coach them, you give them a sample task and you watch how they work through the task. Who does usability testing at the end of their projects? About the same. I'll give you a little bit more credit. Who does usability testing during their project, so before the end? Well, almost as many. Well, that's good. Okay. So if you have to leave now, first fill out your evaluations, and then you already know some things that you can do when you get back home to improve your user experience. And we haven't even talked about a single pixel yet. I'm going to keep moving. I said I'd tell you 5 things before you even start laying out an individual screen. And it's so that you don't create screens like this. So I stole this from a Microsoft presentation about bad design. So therefore, it's been independently verified as bad design. What's wrong with this? Anything? The first thing I heard was clutter. Right, so there's an awful lot going on. What do we mean by, what is clutter? How do we know when something's cluttered? Lack of white space. Yeah, so we're talking about a lack of white space. So one of the reasons that this thing is cluttered is that the eye is looking for places to rest. So we call this, we would critique this design by saying it's very flat, in the sense that there are no sort of hills and valleys and places for the eye to rest as it scans this thing. And white space is one of the simplest ways that we can do that. Just injecting a little bit of air into our screens just gives the eye some markers to use as it scans through the page, and that's one of the best ways to reduce clutter. There are other ways as well. What else is wrong with this design?
It's a web page with phone numbers on it.
It's a web page with phone numbers on it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a rule against having phone numbers on a web page, but I guess the point you're making is they haven't provided a web alternative to getting information about whatever it is that blue thing's about. And so that's about thinking about our end user and the way that they're likely to want to work. Sorry? What's wrong with the colours on it? There's not enough black. There are problems with the colours here. Those hot colours, the red and the yellow, and this is probably making it worse because I think this has been expanded a little bit, are really hard to focus on. The fact that it's grey on one side and has some hot colours on the other side tends to make us think that the whole thing's going to fall over to the left. because those hot colours attract our eye more, and so designers literally talk about visual balance, and they say, you know, that's a heavy element, that's a light element, and when you look at a page like this and you're sort of thinking about the weight of each of those elements, you can see how it might be tipping over. And it turns out that, you know, all other things being equal, we prefer things that are kind of, you know, evenly balanced. So what is, you know, so here's a designer trick that isn't even on the slides here, but it's like one of the simplest designer tricks to coming up with a pleasing layout, and that's symmetry. You can't always get away with it, but, you know, our eyes like symmetry. Our eyes like, and so if you can lay things out so that they're relatively symmetric, and certainly so they're evenly weighted, you're off to a good start. Why do we like symmetry so much? Because we like faces, right? Our eyes are hard-coded to find faces. It's so that when we're born, we can find mum, right? Because when we're first born, our eyes aren't really good because they're kind of squashed. Do you know this? Your eyeballs don't grow. They come out full size. But it's only when your sort of skull grows a little bit that your eyes can actually focus properly. So you're hardwired to look for faces in the visual field as soon as you're born. You can't recognise anything else, but you can recognise faces because it's hard-coded into your brain. And therefore, one of the things our brain is constantly doing is looking for symmetry, because that's one of the cues to a face, right? So we can use that to our advantage and use symmetry in our design. So that was a bonus one. It isn't even in the slide deck. What else is wrong with this?
No direction.
No direction? What do you mean?
Where do I start?
Where do I start? Right. So this was related to visual weight, and because we would normally use visual weight as a way to direct the eye through the page. If all other things being equal, if you have a completely flat page, what we tend to do is read the page left to right, top to bottom, at least here in the Western world, because that's how we were trained to read books. But what we've learnt, certainly on the web, is to look for the cues that the designer has left for us to tell us where to look and what order she or he wants us to look in. The problem with this page is because it's so flat and because it's so dense, it's really hard to pick out where I should start and how I should scan this page. So everyone, this is a designer trick. Everyone squint at this. Squint and then tell me what stands out. Right, so a few people varied, but most people said the blue ad, right? So we would say is, from a design point of view, that that's the heaviest item on the page. Now just have another look at it and see what it is. It's an ad for placing your ad on that space on our website. Now, you know, experienced designers will play all sorts of tricks with visual weight, but for us newbies, what we want to do as we're laying out a page or screen is basically ask ourselves, what do we want to see people to see, in what order, and let's assign visual weight to those things in that order. Good designers know how to break those rules, but for us, that's a really good rule to start with. We'll talk a little bit more about visual weight later. A couple of other problems with this page. All this uppercase text. A little bit of uppercase text is nice because it helps us to differentiate, say, a heading from body text. But here's the thing about text. When we process text, when we read text, one of the first things we do is we look for the outline shape of the word as the first cue to what the word might be. And that's just the way our eyes process things in space, right? Because as our eyes scan the room, say, our brain is trying to distinguish individual objects from each other rather than just a flat mass of colour. And so the first thing our brain looks for is edges. And that's the first cue to what I might be looking at. And that's why tigers have those stripes, right? To try and trick us into not spotting that, hang on a sec, there's a tiger in the jungle over there. And most of these, you know, visual hardwired algorithms actually come from exactly that, trying to spot what's going to kill us in the jungle and what's going to look after us, like our mums. So uppercase text is actually harder to read than lowercase or mixed case text because each word has the exact same rectangular shape. So on a really complex page like this, all the more reason why you might use mixed case. Another thing that annoys me from a design point of view, this is less of a visual and more of an information design thing, is this featured partner box there. We talk about, Jared Spool is a sort of a usability rock star, and he has this term called scent of information. And what we need to do on the home page and on every page of our site is provide a scent of what's lower down. And featured partner is a big heavy element on the page, but I've got no idea what to expect down there. So there's a bit of an information problem there. We haven't exposed enough of the scent of what's below that link. You probably can't read all this fine detailed text, but basically it's pretty funny actually. Looking for something, the Graphics Art Exchange is the premier internet destination for finding used printing equipment. So basically, whenever I come to review someone's design and I see the design trying to explain its own purpose, that's really a cue to me that this is an excellent consulting opportunity for me. They've kind of given the game away if they've started to inject instructions on how to use their own UI into the page. And particularly on the web, but pretty much everywhere, we know that people don't read. And so that's just lost space there. There's a bunch of other problems with this. The fact that the logo, which actually tries to identify this page, doesn't stand out. The split navigation between two places. There's a whole bunch of problems with this page. Let's learn a few lessons with our remaining time, see if we can fix it. The point that I was supposed to make on that slide is that if you think design is all about graphics, you're wrong. Graphics come last. And visual design has two roles. The first role is not the role you expect. The first role is to communicate to the user or the reader all the good work we've done up until that point in information design and interaction design and usability and coming up with our labeling and laying out our page and making it usable and useful. That's the main job of visual design. Setting the tone, creating a mood, is its second role. And don't be fooled by that. And I will often get into discussions with graphic designers about a graphic element on the page, and I'm like, why did you do it this way rather than that way? And they'll say, well, because this looks better. And I'm like, well, looks better, comes second to trying to achieve our goals, whatever our goals are. And I've had a few of those conversations in my time. So it's talking of goals. Start any project by understanding what your objectives are, as I was saying. And I break them up in these 4 types of goals. Probably you don't need to be quite as obsessive as I am here, but in a nutshell, user goals are all about what is the user trying to achieve when they use our site or our product. How do they want to feel? How do they expect to work? What are their expectations? You can't do design for people until you understand the people you're designing for. So one way to start is setting those goals and understanding those goals. You also need to know your business goals. That's usually not so hard. Someone will just tell you that. We're here to save money. We're here to sell more product. We're here to whatever it is. Just be on the lookout for places where the user goals and the business goals aren't aligned. And it happens more often than you'd think. And making sure that you're sending a clear message to the users of what's going on and what your objective is at any one point. Users, in my experience, will appreciate you being honest and authentic rather than just trying to trick them. Once you've set those 2 goals, you can tease it out a little bit. And you can ask yourself, what does usability mean for us? And oftentimes, you'll say, well, I just want my site to be usable. Well, duh. And one of the first conversations we have to have is, what do we mean by usable? What's usable in our context? Does it mean easy to learn? Or does it mean productive? Does it mean error-free? Or does it mean flexible? Does it mean that I'm able to multitask? Or does it mean that I'm going to be immersed and fully engaged in experience? When you actually tease it out, usability means a lot of things. It's really useful to know what's important to you, because oftentimes when you're having design discussions about one option versus the other, it's your usability goals that will save you from an argument. Because you've got this option, or you've got this option, or you've got several options. And you just take a step back to your usability goals and you score them against your usability goals and your experience goals. And often you can resolve that problem. But you can only do that if you've set your goals up front. It's a really simple exercise. You can do it on the way home tonight. Just ask yourself, what constitutes usability for the product that you're using at the moment? And then ask yourself the second question, what kind of experience we want to create here? And this is kind of creepy, and we have to talk about emotions, but once again, you need to know this before you start design, and certainly before you start visual design. So how do we want people to feel when they use our product? I've been working recently at Cochlear, which are the people that make these bionic hearing implants. It's the most awesome gig ever, I got to tell you. One of the products we're using, which I've renamed X, has the following usability experience goals. So these are our 3 personas. These are 3 audiologists. Anna's a speech therapist. Jerry is a hearing aid audiologist who's moving into cochlear implant tuning, and Hamati's a junior cochlear implant audiologist. And this new product is for these guys. And we basically, in order to set the tone for all our graphics and visuals, we set these 5 experience goals. When I use product X, I feel calm, confident, credible, professional, and flipping it over, product X feels approachable. So you can set these goals. If you've made personas, which we've talked about at a previous talk here, if you've created these people who embody your target audience, it's really easy to say, well, hang on a sec, let's talk about Jerry's job. How does he want to feel? How does he want NFS? Oops, I just named it. How does he want... how does he... We'll scrub that job. No, it's all right. How does he want people to feel? I went to so much trouble. Here's the thing, right? You are not your user. And every UX talk you go to, someone at some stage says this. You're not designing for yourself. And saying to yourself, well, I would totally be able to use that, or I would totally enjoy using that, is a bad idea. You're much better off trying to put yourself in the shoes of your target audience rather than yourself. Even if you're making a product that is for people exactly like you. So even if you are making online banking, right? And you figure, well, I use online banking. I can use myself as a sample test subject. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that even when you are the sample user? The answer is that most people who use online banking haven't just been working on an online banking project for the last 18 months, right? They haven't thought about it as deeply as you, right? They haven't thought about the problem as deeply as you. So even if you're designing something for someone exactly like you to do something that you would do, you still can't rely on yourself as the arbiter of what makes sense, what's usable, what's enjoyable. I've got to keep going. Test early and test often. This is the other thing you get in every user experience talk, the importance of usability testing. We talked about it when we ran our little poll, right? Users do the darndest things. If you obsess about trying to create the perfect user interface before you show it to anyone, you are setting yourself up for failure. So the right attitude to go into is, my user experience is crap, and the responsible thing to do is to find out how it's crap as quickly as possible, before we've spent too much time and emotion on code, for example. So this is an informal test going on at Cochlear. Saji here is one of our in-house clinical audiologists. This is Shannon. He's actually one of the coders. We run much more formal tests in labs with cameras and stuff, but these informal tests, we just use whomever we can. He's got headphones on. The prototype is simulating the noises that a bionic implant recipient would hear. And Saji's doing the whole tuning this guy's implant. And that's Yaz in the background. He's the visual designer and interaction designer on the project. You do these tests and you find really interesting things. And this is not a setup, Saji here not looking at the UI. That's exactly what happens in the real environment, right? Because you're trying to assess how well someone is hearing, potentially someone who has never heard before, right? It's tough. So all of our design is focused on allowing the operator to focus as little as possible on the screen so they can focus all their attention on the recipient. Anyway, this is not a story about Cochlear, but test early, test often. Next tip I've called go with the flow, and I think I talked about this last year. Where your user experience can get into the most trouble is where you don't understand the journey that a user needs to take through your application. When you think about all the work we've done on this Cochlear thing, since I'm talking about it, all the UX work we've done over the last 8 months, off the top of my head, probably 3/4 of it is all about navigation and flow. And probably only 1/4 of it is what widgets do we need on any one screen. Because getting that flow right, understanding, creating the right mental model, directing users through the application in the way that we want is way harder and is way more expensive to fix if you stuff it up. So that's why the first exercise, we talked about Sketchflow earlier today. Sketchflow has some tools in it that can help you sort of map out that journey before you even draw any screens. So those were my 5 tips before you even start laying out a page. Remember that graphics are the last thing that you'll do. You'll solve a lot of design arguments if you set goals up front. You are not your user, so learn as much as you can about your user, possibly even write some personas. Test early, test often, and the first thing to understand is the flow of your application. Not the flow of the screens, just the flow of the tasks will help you come up with a great design. All right, let's get into the meat of it and talk a bit more about layout and presentation. Four layout tips, that's all. It's pretty simple. 5 presentation tips. So what we're doing here is, despite everything I've said about all the stuff you need to do up front in conceptual design and creating an interaction model and information architecture, what I want to focus on for the rest of this talk is what you do at the pointy end when you're actually literally selecting widgets and laying out screens. And so I've got, as I say, 4 tips for layout and 6 tips for presentation. Tip number 1. Big surprise, map out the workflow. So we were talking just a second ago about understanding the workflow of the entire application. We will do, once we come to the point of designing any one screen or page, we'll do the same exercise, but for that screen or page. So we'll ask yourself, of all the features and functions that we've allocated to this page, what's the sequence and flow that the user's going to go through when they use that? Ask yourself that. Don't need to draw a screen. It could be a bullet point. It could be a flow diagram. Whatever it is, ask yourself that order. So what I want to do for the remaining slides is we're going to do a case study. So this is a UI for someone produced for wget, which is wget is a command line utility for pulling down HTML websites. And some poor bastard created a few years ago a GUI for it and was, and copped a little bit of flack for his GUI. And I'm not necessarily going to help today, except say this. That he has gone on to create new improved UI. So this is the 5-year-old version of the UI. The UI has moved on and is much better now. But I thought I'd just take this as a single screen example that we could work with. It's a little bit sort of potted and it's not particularly highly branded. It's more sort of an application UI. But we might just take it through the steps and see where we get. What I'm not going to do is change the interaction model, right? So I'm not going to break it up and put it into tabs or into a wizard or anything like that. Basically, the rule I've set myself here is, if this is the screen and these are the functions that we need to place on this screen, how could we better present it within the constraints of this box, okay? If we're talking information design, I might pull this thing apart and put it together a completely different way. We're not going to do that. So the workflow of this thing maybe goes something like this. You want to load pre-existing settings. You set the URL that you want to fetch. You possibly nominate specific hosts that you want to accept or reject. You might choose file types and on and on. I've sort of posited that these are the overall steps. It doesn't mean that everyone is going to do all these steps. They certainly won't, and they certainly won't all do it in that order. But generally speaking, if I was a newcomer to this site, to this application, and you wanted to step me through the process, then you might say, well, first consider this, then consider this, then consider this, then consider this, and the last thing you want to do is press the start button. So come up with your workflow for your application and set that aside. Then ask yourself, what content do I need to support that functionality? So for a GUI, this is literally where we choose the widgets. For a website, we might also have to think about other types of content like graphics and images and stuff like that, and and everywhere in between on that spectrum. So for every element, for every piece of content or functionality, ask yourself what widgets you need, and make sure that you're compliant with any sort of standards you have for your platform. So if you're doing Windows Phone, for example, there are a whole bunch of standard widgets that you probably want to take into account. Or maybe you have some corporate guidelines. So there's only a few things to say about wget in that respect. Some places where I probably would have used radio buttons rather than checkboxes. Probably because this is a very mouse-driven UI, I would have provided spin buttons on that little depth text box, and similarly for the number of retries. Conventionally, if you're going to put in a file, you'd have a browse button next to it, so maybe they should have done that. And that's really all I'm going to say about the widget selection for this guy. Exit, sorry. There's nothing wrong with an exit button per se, but because this is such a cluttered screen, I'm inclined to remove the exit button, and if they want to exit, they can use the red cross up the top. On another screen, I might have kept it. So that's before, and so after we remove those things, the UI isn't particularly different. We've just added some We've just changed this for radio buttons. We've inserted a browse button. I've inserted a browse button here. This layout is obviously not desirable, but we'll fix that in a subsequent step. All right, so that's step one and step two, coming up, understanding your workflow and just choosing your widgets. A note on choosing your widgets or choosing the right combination of widgets. There's a bunch of really useful pattern libraries out there. I chose, this is just one example, it's called Quince from Infragistics, and let me get my mouse. I just picked this because it's Silverlight. Seemed appropriate here at Microsoft. There are other ones. Yahoo has a nice pattern library, and there are other ones out there. The cool thing about this is if you're not sure, how to get some functionality across, maybe you need to sort through search results, or you need to compare options side by side, all sorts of various different sorts of scenarios, shopping cart scenarios. These pattern libraries let you search through different sort of canonical UI solutions in different formats, and give you examples of how they've been used on various sites and applications. So it can be a really useful tool. So check out Quince and Yahoo pattern library and some other places. Step three is to take that combination of widgets and our workflow and basically just do a naive layout on the page. And I don't always do this because sometimes I've kind of done this step in my head, but if I'm not sure, just as a exercise, I take all the widgets that I think I need and I lay them out left, right, top to bottom on the page, all the way down to the last thing I want people to do. And it's a good starting proposition. People are often nervous to start drawing their UI, so just giving yourself permission to do something as naive as this is a great way to get your pencil moving and to start thinking about how the UI might need to be. So, so as you do this, and even as you do this, you might think, well, hang on, that's not going to work, I need to adjust it. But you're already starting to think about how you can arrange your page to support a workflow, to support a natural workflow. Here's an example of our friends at Microsoft doing this wrong. So you might have seen this dialogue before, and what it allows me to do is edit custom properties in an Office document. And the way it works is, in order to edit, say, the properties of the background color property, if that makes sense, I need to select it from the bottom here and then make all the edits up above. So there's just a classic example of getting your workflow wrong. It would have made much more sense to flip those two things around, right? At least I think so. So getting the order right. Here's wget in the current state. If we overlay the order, we can see that if I was right with my workflow, we start down here with load settings, then maybe you enter the URL, then you go to the host, then you accept reject, then you jump over there for your retrieval options, you do the stuff in the middle, and then the second last thing might be to save settings, and then the last thing might be to start the app. So you can see how we're asking the user to jump around. Now, given how dense this page is, the least we could do is help step them through the process, rather than doing what I'm sure the designer did here, which is basically work out the relative sizes of his different group boxes and then create the page that was the most clever, optimal combination of those boxes, not thinking about the flow through. So if that's before, maybe after looks something like this, where you start by loading the settings, then you nominate your URL, then you choose your hosts, then you accept and reject your file types, you go through your other options, the second last thing you do is save your settings, and the last thing you do is start the thing. So basically just by rearrange, I haven't changed the layout or anything, I've just rearranged those exact same boxes. Hopefully it's easier to process how I should approach this application and how I should use it. The last thing you should do before you finish layout is to make sure that by doing this exercise you haven't broken any natural groupings. Because it may be, and your workflow will reveal this to you, that okay, so you've laid things out in the order that you expect people to use it, but hey, these two concepts are related, and I really should have kept them together. And you might have done that already, but you just need to check and make sure that you've provided logical groupings. Our brains love groupings and categories, right? Because, hey, the world's a complicated place, and our brains are programmed to look for categories so that they can say, rather than sort of saying, right, there's, roughly 200 or 300 people in this room, and there's that guy, and there's that guy, and there's that guy, and there's that guy. Instead, my brain is already saying there's delegates or whatever we want to call you guys. And we're at a conference, and that's a category in my brain. And I'm doing a presentation, and that's a category in my brain. Your brain does this stuff, right? Just to make the world simpler. And we should be doing the same thing. We should be providing cues to our users about how they can group related things together so they don't have to process each individual item, they can process them as a group. So for wget, there's only a couple of things that we probably want to fix. These two options around depth probably should sit together. All the options around the settings probably belong together, even though we had load and save at either end. So we'll bring those two together and we'll bring the depth together and we can probably move on. Alrighty, that was our 4 layout steps. How simple can it be? Now let's talk about a bit about presentation. I've got 6. I can't really call them steps because they're not strictly speaking would you go about them in exactly this order, but your chances are you'd start at number 1 and you'd end up at number 6. The first one is remove every unnecessary element. I was just telling you that our eyes have to process everything in the visual field, right? So whether you're conscious of it or not, your brain is going, is that a tiger? No, it's not a tiger. Is that a tiger? Your brain's doing that all the time, right? So we want to be polite to our poor users and don't put stuff in their visual field that is unnecessary. The possible exception to that has been designing games where you might actually be deliberately trying to overstimulate. But most of the time for the sites and applications we're designing, every single element that we place on the page has to be there for a reason. It might be there for a decorative reason. We might be saying, well, we've put this background pattern in because we're trying to create a luxurious tone to the page. That's cool, but you need to be able to justify that. And you need to dial back, as far as you can, remove everything that you possibly can until you've got the bare minimum required to communicate the functionality and the tone. So what did our friend at wget do wrong in terms of unnecessary elements? The thing that stands out to me most is these awesome double group boxes. A whole lot of visual detail attracting you to one of the least useful elements on the entire page, the group box itself. So we probably want to remove that. Also, we can probably, in this case, because it's a cluttered page, I'm going to remove these clear buttons and let the user just use the mouse and delete key. Well, let's hide the scroll bars until they're absolutely necessary. And as I was saying, we can tidy up these double group boxes. So I think that's all I did on this page. So that was before, and this is after. Notice the difference. The other thing I did is I went for the standard Windows colours here. So rather than this dark grey with light boxes, I went to the more standard lighter grey with dark boxes. I built this in Blend. Blend just told me what the system colours are, so it wasn't too hard. Already the page is a little easier to process for your eye. You still can't quite work out what you're supposed to do, but at least as you approach it, you can see some groupings. You can see that there's a flow to it, and you can start to process it more easily. Related to removing every element is to remove variation. When we were at school and we were doing English, we were taught this idea of elegant variation, right? Don't use the same word again and again and again. Well, pretty much the opposite applies when we're designing our applications and sites. Err on the side of consistency. Ask yourself, the first thing you should ask yourself is, do I need to present this element or this page or this combination of widgets in some way that's either consistent with some other part of my site or application, or that is consistent with some other application or site that people have seen before? Now, yes, you might have arguments for why you need to vary from what's consistent, but don't just do it for the sake of it. Have a reason to make that variation. And that allows you to use variation judiciously to communicate change. And so I don't mean make a completely flat website where every page looks the same. Quite the opposite. If we minimize variation throughout the bulk of the site, then we can use variation to clearly indicate you're in a different part of the site, or you're on a very important page that's crucial that you get right, or you've come to the end of the process or a start of the process. We can then use variation to actually communicate something rather than just being a conceit. Which brings us to colours. So I wanted to give you a few tips about use of colour. Basically, it all comes down to this. Has everyone got their pen ready? Red and green should not be seen without a colour in between. That's about it. That's pretty much all I know. Oh, no, all right, I'll tell you a bit more. First question to ask yourself is, how many colours should I use? It's easy as you're designing an application to say, oh, this is a new element or a new type of element, maybe I should introduce a new colour at this point. Question is, when do you stop, right? How do you avoid that angry fruit salad where you've added so many colours that the thing just becomes a little bit like Kitty's birthday party spew. So this is simple, right? To work out how many colours you should use, you first need to rate yourself as a designer. So along this scale, give yourself a 1 if you have no visual design skill at all. Give yourself a 5 if you're an awesome visual designer. And that's cool. I mean, don't be modest. So has everyone got a number in their head? I'm not going to ask you what it is. Has everyone rated themselves from 1 to 5? Okay. So you use that number to work out how many colours you should use. In fact, that is how many colours you should use. It sounds funny, but I'm deadly serious, right? If you're not confident with use of colour, you are much better off scaling back your use of colour and using 1 or 2 colours only than going crazy with a whole spectrum. And you can create great design with restrained use of colour. Don't get me wrong at all. So don't be afraid to use less colour, not more. One tip though, if you're using a restrained palette, you just need to make sure that you aren't creating relationships that are implied by your use of colour that you didn't actually mean. So just bear that in mind. A couple of other really quick colour tips. That would be on slide 52. This is slide 51. Some tips. There are some neutral colours, grey, white, black, navy blue, brown, if you're up for it, that tend to go with everything. So if you're not confident, at least start with your main colour being one of those. Sorry, what was that? Yeah, black, sorry. I thought you were saying black's missing. The other thing is that cool colours tend to look further away and hot colours tend to look closer to us. It's just to do with how they focus differently on our retina. So use that to your advantage, right? Things that you want to appear closer, make them hotter. Things that you want to appear further away and to recede into the background, use blues and greens, cooler colours. Once again, a good designer knows how to break this trick, but if we're not confident, we shouldn't break it. And hopefully you get the point with that second one there, right? The red, which should be the background, is kind of jumping forward, yeah? And so already your eyes are starting to really struggle to try and process that. And we don't want to make more work than we need to. So one tip, if you're only using one colour, is to vary the shade or saturation. Thank you. And Blend lets you do this. A lot of people don't realise if you right-click on the colour picker in Blend, you can switch from RGB to hue, light and saturation. And that way you can pick one hue and then just vary the saturation or just vary the lightness in order to create a colour scheme that pretty much is always guaranteed to work. And in fact, that's exactly what PowerPoint does these days with its pre-built colour schemes. You pick your basic colours and it suggests to you different tints of that same colour. We can do that as well. Another old graphic designer trick to come up with a colour scheme is to try and find some photo that expresses the mood that you're trying to get across. And if the photo seems appealing and attractive to you and seems to get across the mood, then you can use that as a basis for your colour palette. It's the oldest trick in the book, particularly when you're trying to justify a colour choice to stakeholders and they're asking you a lot of hard questions. Sometimes this sort of strategy can sort of shut that conversation down. Here's a couple of websites that are worth checking out. Cooler.adobe.com is a great site that gives you a whole bunch of palette suggestions. Let me just bring it up. And you can even just type in names. So in our experience goals, maybe we're going for confident. You can type in confident here, confidenty. And if you're lucky, you might get a palette that works for you. So here's a bunch of ones that have been tagged as confident. And you can put it, whatever tone you're going for, put it in here. You never know your luck. The other trick that you can do with Cooler is, I think it's Cooler, maybe it's supposed to say colour, I say Cooler, is that you can create your own palette. And there's a few different ways you could do it, and probably the coolest way to do it is from an image, right? So what we can do is we'll upload our wheat field and see what it does. It picks out a palette for us. Awesome. And you can even choose different tones, right? We'll go for the dark version any second now, or we'll go for the muted version. All right? So here's a trick for coming up with palettes that's really handy. The other one is this site called Colour Lovers. Very similar, although it's not specific about web design. And you can type in your word here as well, confident. Do our little search. One of the things I like about Colour Lovers is it doesn't just give you your colour results, but it also suggests to you the relative proportions that you should use those colours. So rather than just evenly spacing, it says, all right, well, for this palette, we're suggesting a whole lot of white and ice blue and a relatively small amount of these sort of more saturated colours. So here's another great resource if you're trying to come up with this colour scheme. Okay, keep moving, Shane. Just beware of colour blindness. About 10% of males have some sort of colour deficiency. So just check that if you're trying to communicate things with colour, you're also using some sort of redundant cue like shape or a label, so that you're not just relying on people being able to spot colours as a way to identify different elements on the page or different functions. This site, vischeck.com, is really handy. There's a few sites like this. You can feed it your URL and it'll feed you back renderings of the page with different sort of colour blindness effects simulated, or you can upload a JPEG of your comp and get the result back as well. How many different typefaces should I use? Similar exercise. Does everyone remember their number from before? They're from 1 to 5? Okay, you get the idea. How many different typefaces should you use? The answer is 1. Okay? Let's move on to the next thing. So once again, right, experienced designers know how to mix and match their typefaces. We don't. Okay? So we're going to use one typeface and we're just going to vary the size and possibly the weight of it. Line stuff up. This is a classic designer trick. Our eyes love things that line up because it makes it easy for us to process the page or the screen because it gives our eyes little channels to run along. So when I saw this in the keynote, I thought I had to grab a copy of this. Imagine yourself like this. You've got an element in your hand that you need to place somewhere on the page. What should it line up with? What can it line up with? Because our eyes love alignment, right? And so designers come up with these grids and they set these grids in place first and then they try to align everything against those grids. WGET has a few alignment problems. The clear box sort of floating in the middle rather than, say, aligned with the bottom of the box that relates to. The label not left aligned with the box. The baseline of the text of those two elements not aligned. Similarly there. More misalignment there. The actual top of those group boxes is not aligned. Now, it seems kind of like, oh, we're just in the realm of decoration. You'd be surprised how you can turn an unprofessional design into a professional design just by applying this trick. And here's the other trick, right? If you look professional, people will think you are professional. And usability tests prove this, right? When we show the exact same user interface to people, one that doesn't look nice and the other one that looks nice, but otherwise exactly the same widgets and labels and layout, people will rate the more professional layout one as being easier to use, okay? Because we process user interfaces just like we process people. And if the user interface is kind of untidy and a little bit schizophrenic and unreliable and unpredictable and seems to change all the time, we're like, that guy's kind of weird. I don't really want to have too much to do with him. If you present yourself as being consistent and credible and professional and predictable, you're off to a great start. So we need to fix some of those problems for our little UI. So before it was like that, and after, just a little tweaking there, but we've just tidied up some of the layout and got some of our alignment sorted out. We've bottom aligned that group box there so that we don't get that jagged. We've left aligned the text there. We've left aligned the labels and the widgets. We've aligned the baseline of the text. I should emphasize that baseline of the text thing because sometimes you're not sure how you should align text of different sizes or text in a label with text in a widget. And the answer is what we align is that baseline there, right? So the bottom of the body of the text is what we line up when we're aligning text. Here's a website I'd love to show you because this is the version of the Vic Road site that was done after the version I designed. And the lesson is to beware of unintended relationships. So that we've got a nice grid going on here, some nice vertical alignment, until you look at it closely, right? We've got registration in cars, licensing in heavy vehicles, road safety in motorcycles, rules and bicycles, roads and boats. So our eyes at first say, oh, cool, categories. I love categories. Nice alignment tells me these are categories because we're looking for lines, right? Lines tell us that these things all belong together. So our eye is telling us these things are related, but they're not. So you want to avoid creating any implication of grouping that you didn't intend. See this accept aligned with the left and reject aligned with the right? There's a danger there that people are going to associate the right radio button with the right checkboxes and the left radio button with the left checkboxes. So be on the lookout for that kind of thing. We were talking about white space before. Not only do we like space as a place for our eyes to rest, but our eyes also like things to be spaced evenly, to be evenly sized. And the reason is that we don't actually scan the page with our eyes, we actually jump around. So our eyes, it's called saccading, our eyes actually jump. So as I'm looking here and thinking I need to look over there, what's going on in my peripheral vision is my brain is choosing a target for me to jump to. And I can see there's one guy around about there who's sort of a little taller than everyone else, and so I can see his head against the beige background. And that's where my eye's going to jump. What's going on there is I'm picking a target, right? We don't just sweep our eyes across. Our eyes actually jump across. So we can do our users a favour by providing them those gaps and providing even spacing. Just makes it easier for our eyes to process. Now, you will break this rule plenty of times, but my point with rules like this is, until you have a reason to break it, don't break it. So start by laying out your page evenly like this, and then check whether you've miscommunicated anything or you've created inappropriate grouping, for example. Over at wget, we need to fix some of our... The main problem with spacing here is inconsistent spacing between the widgets. Between the different elements there, different height of buttons, different sizes of buttons. So we can tidy up, this is before, and we can tidy that up a little bit by just injecting consistent layout and consistent sizing of most of the buttons. And already, I mean, this was one of the big differences, I think, from here to here. And it's about the white space, and it's about providing places for the eye to rest. So I really want to emphasize this. We haven't changed any of the functionality at all. We haven't effectively changed the widgets at all, except where there was some some standards violations. And yet I think we're already making it an easier to use application. Sorry, now we need to talk about grouping and visual weight, and then, oh geez, we're about to run out of time. Let's go really fast. Yes, you can use group boxes for grouping, but as we've said a couple of times, there are other ways to do it. Things that are similar allow us to actually create groupings that aren't implied just by their placement. So this can be a really useful trick when I want you to associate that thing with that thing. We can use similarity. The other thing that we do is we assume two things that are close together are somehow related. So we might assume the blue and red elements have some relationship there, even though they don't look the same. When we've talked about alignment, right? Things that line up, we assume there's some sort of relationship. Our eyes are looking for those lines to group things together. And of course, white space is our superpower. I might have to skip that example. So we can do a better job of indicating grouping on wget simply by injecting some white space, really. And so what I've done is I've gone through each of the elements and I've injected a bigger gap between some of the little subgroups of elements, and it just injects a little bit of air into the design and makes it a little bit easier to process. And this is the idea of a visual hierarchy. And it's what was wrong with that graphics exchange site that we were looking at before. It didn't allow me to clump the page up, process one part of the page, drill in, process a bit more of the page, drill in and process a bit more of the page. The last thing we need to talk about is visual weight. And in fact, I've made the point about visual weight. Different elements are heavier on the page. They attract our eyes more. We want to use that to our advantage. We want to think about the order that we want people to see the stuff on our page, and we want to apply visual weight appropriately. There's a few different tricks that we can use to make things look heavier on the page. I'm going to have to go really quick, and then we'll wrap up. The first thing I've already said is hot colours, right? Will make something look heavier on the page. Then the next most obvious thing, I guess, is size. The other thing that tends to attract our attention is any sort of contrast, because once again, we're looking for that tiger in the jungle, right? Contrast can be the texture or it can be space around it. Irregular shapes that don't match what's going on around will also attract our eyes because we're trying to find the tiger in amongst the trees, right? And then things that don't line up, similarly, are going to attract our eyes. And now we're getting into the realm of misuse of visual weight. We could use some of these tricks occasionally, but we have to be really careful that we're not overdoing it. 3D will also add to visual weight, and then of course there's then the nuclear option, which is animation, right? Any banner ad designers in the room? No? Okay. Alrighty, we need to wrap up, but I need to sort of tell you how this story ends. So the last thing I did here was try to apply some visual weight. This is a tough gig for something like this because everything's relatively undifferentiated, there's no branding, there's no real mood. So it was tough to work out how to use visuals, and I'm only going to show you this briefly because you may or may not agree with what I've done. But I've given the heaviest visual weight to the bar across the top because that has, in terms of visual hierarchy, that determines the behaviour of everything else. I removed the group boxes altogether just to lighten up the page a little. Whether or not I should have used those blue labels, I don't know. I'm still debating that myself. And the other thing I did, which is you didn't have to do, is that the whole page was kind of flat. I wanted to add more visual weight to the bottom right-hand corner where the start button is. But I didn't want to put all that weight into the button itself because that would make the thing tip over. So what I did is that you can see that the colour sort of gets more saturated down towards that bottom right-hand screen. I mean, designers in the room would say that's a pretty sort of amateur trick. And, you know, even I sort of hesitate, which is why I'm going to move on. So in summary, here's what wget looked like beforehand. Here's what it looked like after. What did we do? We didn't change the interaction model or the information design. All we did was look at the presentation and layout and the selection of widgets. So here's our our 4 layout steps. I'll let you read them yourself because we're out of time. And our 6 presentation steps that we've seen. Don't forget before you start though, you need to know what it is you're trying to achieve. You can't answer any of these layout and design questions unless you know the answer to what it is you're trying to achieve. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Here's a great Microsoft design tutorial site called the Microsoft Toolbox. Check this site out. There's a lot of great online tutorials that talk about good design from a visual design point of view as well as from a user experience point of view. Thanks for your attention and thanks for bearing with me while I went over time a little. Cheers.